Let's look at cognitive development in adolescence, specifically looking at brain function. So, until puberty, your brain cells increase their connections, but during adolescence, there's actually a selective pruning of unused neurons and connections. Basically, what we don't use, we lose. So, if you're a stellar athlete, all of the motor areas of your brain are firing so intensely as compared to maybe somebody who's not an athlete but has other areas of interest where those neural networks are firing really intensely. So, cool way that we can be different. The growth of myelin, those fatty cells around your axons, actually speed neurotransmission during this time of your life, which results in improved judgment on your part, improved impulse control, and long term planning. All of those really good executive functions in the frontal lobe that we need to be successful, functioning humans. Also, during this time, you've got a lot of moods. Some hormone surges are intensifying the moods that you experience, and the limbic system, the emotional part of your brain, is really active. And so, this literally biologically makes teenagers more prone to impulsive behavior, risky behavior, and emotional ups and downs. So, if you are working through a lot of that stuff right now, that is completely developmentally appropriate, and there's a huge biological influence in that. Lots of research shows that teens seek thrills and rewards over rational behavior far more often than adults do with fully developed prefrontal cortices. So when it comes to things like vaping or fast driving or really any negative behavior, the Supreme Court even ruled in 2004 that juvenile death penalties were unconstitutional because literally the biology of your brain is setting you up to be more prone to some of these negative decisions as opposed to being an adult. Okay, so this key development time of the frontal lobes that really still don't mature until your mid 20s really does explain a lot of the risky behaviors that you might see in your friends or the impulse to do some of those things yourself. What else is going on in terms of your cognition, in terms of your thinking? So now you're in this formal operational stage, right? According to Piaget. So there's a concept called adolescent egocentrism, and this is the tendency of teens to view the world only from their own perspective and to think that other people are not as smart as they are, don't tend to know as much as they do about the way that the world works. Another tendency is this tendency toward the imaginary audience, and this is especially true in early adolescence, like right when you're going through puberty. This is the belief that other people are watching your every move and judging you and talking about you way more often than is actually happening. And this can cause stress as adolescents cope with what they imagine others are thinking and saying about them. I remember talking about this one year in my AP Psych class, and one student mentioned that when they were a freshman in high school, they didn't want to walk through the hallways alone because they were afraid that if other people looked at them and saw them walking alone, they would think that they didn't have any friends. And other people in the class were like, oh, I felt similarly. I always wanted to wait to walk with somebody. And one student was even like, yeah, I pretended to just get out my phone and be texting people because they were all so concerned that everybody was looking at them and judging them. When in reality, think about yourself walking through the hallway. You're probably just thinking about what am I doing in my own life? What's next? Did I turn my homework in? That type of a thing. So that's this idea of the imaginary audience. There's also personal fable, which is a sense that you're completely unique and invincible. And in teenagers, this can lead to dangerous behavior because adolescents tend to believe, more so than adults, that harmful consequences aren't going to happen to them, only to someone else. So somebody who thinks, oh, I only had 2 drinks, I can totally drive home from this party. Nothing bad's going to happen to me. When in reality, you shouldn't drive home from a party if you've had 2 drinks. And adolescents are much more prone to think nothing's going to happen to me than adults do. And so they're more likely then to engage in that risky behavior that their brain is compelling them to do. Okay, there is an article activity for you in your interactive notebook today. So I want to encourage you to pause, go ahead and read The Wild World of a Teen Brain. I hope that you'll find this really interesting, you guys, as you continue to live with teenage thoughts, emotions, and behaviors to understand where are those coming from and how do those physiologically contribute to what you're trying to navigate at this point in your lives. Coming back and looking at gender development. So, for this section, we're going to look at some specific terms related to sex and gender and how we define gender from a cultural standpoint. I think that this is really important information to look at, especially because God calls us to be in the world, not of the world. And I think that it's really important for us to understand these gender terms because gender is such a hot topic in our culture right now. And the best way that we can fulfill that great commission that we're called to love other people and share the love of the Lord with them, is to put ourselves in their shoes and to understand how they might be feeling and where they might be coming from. So I want to talk about some of these terms so that we all have shared awareness of what do these mean when we're interacting with people who are the same and who are different from us along these dimensions. Okay, so let's start by distinguishing between sex and gender. Psychologists talk about your biological sex, and that literally just means the chromosome combination that you were born into the world with. So your sex is female when you have an X and a Y, and your sex is male when you have two X chromosomes. Very straightforward biological term is sex. Gender is more complicated. So, gender refers to basically the psychological meaning that we attach to those body parts, the socially constructed roles and characteristics that we expect biological males and biological females to engage in. So, for instance, in many cultures, if you happen to be born with an X and a Y chromosome and you're identified as female sex, you're also expected to be nurturing and caring and want to raise children and those types of things. Whereas if you're male and you're born with those X chromosomes, society attaches gender roles to you, and now you're supposed to want to be aggressive and ambitious and fill in the blank with whatever it happens to be. Okay. Gender identity then is our own innermost concept of feeling male or female and how we perceive ourselves and what we call ourselves. And then gender expression is our external appearance when it comes to gender identity. And usually that's expressed through behavior, tone of voice, your clothing choices, your haircut choices, which may or may not conform to the socially defined behaviors and characteristics that any culture typically associates with being male masculine or female feminine. Okay. For people who identify as cisgender, these things that you see on the screen here tend to match. So I identify as cisgender, right? I have an X and a Y chromosome. I do identify as a female, and I do tend to like the roles that society has put on to me as a female. I'm thrilled to be a mom and a wife. I also enjoy working outside the home. Nobody fits perfectly into a box, right? And so I identify as a female, as a woman, and I tend to have a pretty conforming gender expression as well. Okay. Some people don't, and there are a lot of things that we can unpack around that when we talk together in class next time, but wanted to just explain those terms and what those terms mean and how they're kind of used in the world of psychology. Let's look a little bit more at gender roles. So these are expected behaviors or norms for men and women, and these really do vary across time and place. And we'll talk about some examples of this in class next time. I do think it's important to note that women and men really are more alike than different. Thanks to our similar genetic makeup, we all see, hear, learn, and remember similarly. We're all humans. However, physically, males and females tend to differ in body fat, muscle, height, age of onset of puberty, life expectancy, and vulnerability to disease. Men tend to admit more aggression than women do, and they're more likely to be physically aggressive, whereas women's aggression is more likely to be relational. And we can talk about some social impacts of that next time in class. Typically, still today in societies, men have more social power and their leadership style tends to be directive, whereas women's is more democratic. And then finally, women tend to, on average, focus more on social connectedness than men do. And then finally, in terms of social learning theory, like how do we learn and internalize these gender roles is a big question in psychology. A lot of people point back to Bandura's study that basically through reinforcement, punishment, and observation, and seeing the way that other people identify in the world around us, that's how we learn to adopt particular gender roles. Critics of social learning theory argue that, well, cognition would at least have to play some role because if just modeling and rewards explained gender typing, then everybody would probably follow that cisgender model. But we do have transgender people in the world and other things like that. So there must be some sort of conscious cognitive decision making going on as well, not just social learning.